And this webinar series is a part of Social Science and Human Resources Council Canada Connection Grant Initiative Global Network Forum on Communication for Agriculture, Rural Development, and Environment. You're probably aware of that within broader communication studies, there are scholars and practitioners working around the world on theories, methods, and tools to support agricultural and rural communities. So we want to actually document their experience through this initiative. There are a number of partners in that project from Europe, from Asia, from Australia and Canada. And definitely their support is very important for our connection grant, and I acknowledge their support and encouragement. Because of that, this initiative is there, and we are able to implement this webinar series. So what we want to achieve out of this initiative, we want to achieve three things: outreach, and then an event and a publication. So as part of outreach, we want to organize a couple of webinar series and knowledge mobilization event. And then our goal is to organize an event, a workshop, to invite scholars around the world and share their work. And finally, based on outreach and event, we want to publish an edited book or journal special issue. So that's very important, and that's an important focus of our initiative. And if any one of you are interested to be part of any of these activities, please reach out to me, and I'm happy to discuss the opportunities. So this webinar series, three-part webinar series. In the first part today, we're going to discuss participation basics and what are non-negotiables. And then in the second part, perhaps in winter, we'll discuss about participatory digital tools and methods. And finally, in the spring or summer, we're going to discuss about participation in the digital age. So the idea is that based on part one and part two, we will be able to answer the question how we can define participation, given that everybody has to now somehow participate through digital means or remotely or online. So how does it actually mean for in this era? So again, especially for part two and part three, if anyone interested to be involved in any capacity, please let me know and reach out to me, and I'll be happy to discuss the opportunity. So today I'm really happy that for this session we have Dr. Ricardo Ramirez as a speaker. Ricardo Ramirez brings over 30 years of experience as an independent researcher and consultant based in Guelph, Ontario. He worked with NGOs in Latin America, with the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, and with ILEIA in the Netherlands. He is an adjunct professor in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development, University of Guelph. His current consulting work includes the design and implementation of utilization focus and developmental evaluation approaches, capacity development in evaluation and communication, multi-stakeholder and collaborative approaches for natural resource management, and participatory planning in complex adaptive context. Recently, he published two books. One is Communication for Another Development, Listening Before Telling, and the second one is Utilization Focused Evaluation, a Primer for Evaluators, published in 2014. Since 2009, he has co-directed DECI, an IDRC-funded capacity building and research project that trains researcher in evaluation and communication in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Ricardo Ramirez. He will present for this morning. And then me and my colleague, Dr. Gautam Gao, is also help him to facilitate some of the interactive part of this webinar series. And I hope you'll enjoy, and thank you to joining us for this morning. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm going to try and share my screen. All right, so I'm going to be sharing a presentation in two parts. This is an outline of the session. Very soon, in the next slide, we're going to ask you through the chat to share your expectations of this presentation, just to get a sense of where you're coming from. We had quite a list of participants, and it's always useful to hear what people are expecting and thinking about. And then part one will be the meaning of participation. I'm going to speak a lot about the issue of context, about unpacking the meaning of the term, and very important, qualifying what participation means in terms of stages of project or program development, different types of ladders of participation. And then we'll have a quick chat to see how this relates to your own experiences in participation. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about effective use, and I'll explain where this term comes from. It may be familiar to some of you from Michael Gernstein's work. And I'll put a lot of emphasis on the issue of readiness, because that's one of the main aha moments I've had over the last few years of like preconditions to allow for participation to flourish. I'll share a little bit about methods and approaches through an example, and I'll start talking a bit about methods and media, which is, I know, more of the focus for the second session, but it's a precursor. And then we'll have a fairly substantial breakout room to help you digest, make meaning out of this, and then we'll bring that back for a Q&A. When we get to the breakout room, Harold was going to help explain the procedure. So moving forward, we'd love to hear from you on the chat. What do you expect from this webinar? Would you mind reading some of them?
Yeah, sure, I'll do. So I see, very interested to learn what people attention span and Zoom fatigue to enable participation. Very important. Tools for sharing novel ideas digitally. Further insight into PAR in general. Participatory action research. A lot of criticism about participatory development. I used to be enlightened about it. I think one of the important focus for today's talk. Exchange of innovation techniques and ideas. Interested in hearing someone actively involved with large development organizations speaking about participatory methodology. Yes, I think Ricardo, you can share some of the experience. Ideas for encouraging engagement in webinars and other digital communication. That may be focus of our second part. Hoping to share and learn about the latest developments regarding participatory approaches. Yeah, this is, we'll also discuss. Yeah, so these are, yeah, they're, I think, very interesting ideas that people share.
Okay. That's great. I probably will not be able to satisfy everybody's requirements, but I'll do my best. So moving forward, part one, the meaning. So things that I think are important when we're thinking about participation is to understand context. And I had 5 items to talk about here. One is, what is a political and cultural context? I had an example one time when I had a phone call from the Canadian Army in Quebec asking me to do training and participation for Canadian forces going to Afghanistan. And I declined. I'm not an Army specialist, but I know that in participation, continuity and trust is important, and that's something that military operations do not allow. And so culture and political context are hugely important when you're trying to decide if and how to introduce participatory methods. The next one is very important, which is who owns the decision to introduce participation? Some of the critiques of participation, like the Tyranny of Participation book by Cook and Kotari, talked about the danger of forcing or introducing, especially tools, when we're fascinated with some of the tools, without getting a sense of who owns the problem and who owns the decision to introduce participation. I'll come back to this issue of owning later. 3 and 4 is very important for those of you on this call who are either academics or students. It's very, and I have been in your shoes in the sense that when I was doing my grad work, I was very committed to participatory approaches, and yet I had a degree in my targets. And so the purposes of participation have to be transparent. And the same with number 4 is who you're seeking participation from. Do they actually want to participate in one terms? And do they have the capacity or the agency to participate? We can't take these things for granted. And the last one is, can one's action improve readiness? Can you somehow help create the conditions before starting? And a lot of readiness discussions have to do with things that have nothing to do with methodology, but come back to political and power issues. One of the challenges with the meaning of participation is that everybody sees it differently depending on the context and the situation. And so the old paradox of the blind people feeling different parts of the elephant are very relevant, in that some people think it refers to an activity or a workshop. Others may have a feeling that has to do with democracy and having a say. Others may see it as organizational development. Others can see it as empowerment. And there may be many more definitions. I remember working in Northern Colombia many years ago, and speaking the same language. I'm Mexican originally, but speaking to Colombians in the same language, and participation was understood as free labor in one situation. So understanding that participation is not a universal term, even in different languages, was a lesson for me. So unpacking this a little bit is whom and what do we represent when participating? How do we perceive the context in the project or initiative? And what tacit goals or agendas do we want to channel into a role? And below that, I put a little note that comes from an article that's called Same Platform, Different Train. And it's in the literature that we will share with you from this presentation. But it starts with the story of 2 people meeting on a train platform and having a chat, and finding all kinds of common issues and agreements. And then the 2 trains come going in different directions, and they both get into different trains. And it was a bit of a metaphor for how easily we get carried away with apparent similarities only to have different goals. And so it's a very interesting article that awakens you to not be naive on the conditions into which you're trying to work with participation. One of the hardest things here is legitimacy. Are the people that you want to bring in legitimate representatives, and are you yourself legitimate in your role? So again, this is one of the challenges in unpacking participation from very much a positioning. In feminist literature, it's very much an issue of being transparent and positioning yourself. So I don't really like definitions, but here's an attempt to work with a couple of them. Kanji and Greenwood talk about Participation definitions range from assisting people to exercise democratic rights to a means of obtaining views from different stakeholders. And DFID, the former DFID, I understand, had a definition of participation as enabling people to realize their rights to participate in and access information relating to the decision-making processes which affect their lives. Democratic institutions and access to information about government's policies and performance are necessary to enable people to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. They also need to be able to form organizations such as unions, women's groups, or citizens monitoring groups to represent their collective interests. So participation is very political, and it can therefore be very delicate. And I'm sure some of you will share experiences you've had with the challenges of trying to work through participatory approaches under conditions that are not conducive because of political systems and repression. So the next two slides are very core to this presentation and have to do with the idea that there is no such thing as participation. You have to qualify at what stages of a project and what types of participation are possible. And so one of the difficulties we have in international development, domestic development, is very often we work through cycles either of government or of initiatives or projects. And very often this cycle that's listed here, or stages, are, who defines the agenda for an initiative, who develops the proposal, what are the preparatory phases, what's implementation like, where's the analysis of results or evaluation, and where's the dissemination and action of the findings of this work. I'm working right now with an evaluation where there was complaints by some of the partners that there was very limited participation during the developmental of the proposal. And the coordinating organization basically said, we had no time because the funder had a deadline. And we all live in this deadline world where the deadline imposed by a funder may curtail the chances of consultation or participation. And so often we don't have the possibility of doing participation at the beginning. And that's very delicate because defining the agenda is a very important part, excuse me, of figuring out what the project is all about. Developing the proposal has to do with people having a chance to contribute ideas, methods, contexts. And so if you don't have participation in the early stages, once you get to implementation, there's a lot of stuff that's already set and people will feel disenfranchised. So beware of externally imposed rush is the subtitle at the bottom right, because in many cases, we find ourselves stuck between a deadline and the wish to be participatory. And the only recommendation I would have is be transparent. Be clear of your constraints, because it's impossible to be participatory throughout all of these stages under conditions of restraint. So that's one aspect. And the second one is, excuse me again, is that there are different kinds of participation. Arnstein, back in 1968, in a planning journal, came up with this hierarchy, starting at the bottom with manipulation, therapy, informing, consultation, placation, partnership, delegated power, and citizen control. And you can see that citizen control is consistent with the definitions we just saw before. And then Jules Preti, who at the time when he wrote this, I think was with IIED, he was a pioneer in participatory rural appraisal work, came up with a similar one where you have passive participation, moving up through consultation, and then interactive participation, self-mobilization. Again, as you get to the higher levels, it becomes very demanding in a good sense of political and empowerment. And then Kanji and Greenwood again have a simpler one, but again you can see the continuum. One of the important things here is if you combine the stages with the ladders, you have a framework where you can say, look, for the first stage of the project, because of constraints with the funder, we will only do consultation. However, later on, we'll move to partnership. And so it allows you to be transparent and strategic and qualify what is possible. One of the things that you want to avoid is fabricating a consultation. And I was in a situation working with First Nations in Northern Ontario once where government representatives arrived to do a consultation when in fact they were coming to inform of decisions taken at headquarters. And there was a lot of upset because even if you look at these ladders of participation, consultation, which is in the middle, was not even that. There was no active listening. It was basically a one-way. And so fabricating consultation is a danger. And so these are the major challenges of qualifying what you do, stages and ladders. So moving on to the next slide, this is where we're going to ask you to reflect a bit on in what way these concepts relate to your best experience or your worst experience in participation. And please share that with us through the chat. And I'm going to ask Atta Harold to read some of them as they come in, because for some reason I cannot see the chat while sharing the screen at this point. We'll give that a few minutes.
Ricardo, it's Gordon. I wonder if you could just flip back to that previous slide that shows the concepts there. Thank you.
So there's two slides. One is the different stages of a project, and the next one is the different ladders or stage or levels of participation.
So now go to the question slide, Ricardo. So we are waiting for some input from you guys. How do these concepts relate to your best and your worst experience with participation? So here is one chat. I'm a student, so it is interesting to see how the ladders relate to teaching and learning experiences too. Very interesting. Another one, I think most of the researchers encounter problems on developing the proposals with the lack of participation with the community because of what you mentioned about the externally imposed rush. Very interesting comment. From Tori, I ran into instance of maintaining transparency of timeline constraints, received great participation. And then when it comes to funding deadline was imminent, can you speak to respectfully maintaining boundaries around the participation process? The language used when inviting people to participate is important. It should align with authentic intent. Very interesting. Worst experience, consultants had members develop contribution, but they then never provided opportunity to present and instead provided the predetermined solution. So worst experience probably.
Mm-hmm.
And the next one, as we respond to funding, there's a funding opportunity and work with our networks to build a proposal. Always reflect on how the participatory process at the grassroots level is limited at the start when priorities are determined, even if the implementation or research is participatory. So a little bit critical. Another observation, best experience was running a focus group to do data collection on a project in a fan convention about pop culture materials, which was meant to be informing in a sense. However, the group was so keen and insightful and so brilliant that it developed to an interactive participation in an analysis process. To contrast, I have been to too many rooms in which the meeting title was consultation, when the goal of the meeting was information delivery, sort of similar to the story Ricardo shared. So it's yeah, very interesting experience. And another one, the sponsors do not allow enough time or resources to get local natives to really engage in proposal writing and design. One of the challenge very everybody face, yeah. And there is another one. There are several constraints and paradoxes of participation in both development and research. For example, the participation box is strict and the regulation rules all stays, but in the end, due to timelines, funding politics, it could actually mean just consultation. Yeah, similar kind of exposed experience. Another host experience of participation is the community dissatisfaction at the end of a program since their expectations were not met sufficiently. Very good, interesting. Good.
Maybe I should respond to a few of them looking at time so we can move on.
Yeah.
one early contribution from one of you was to do with this issue of timelines and preparation. And the only times when I felt good about preparation being consultative in line with funders' deadlines was when preparation was a separate project. In other words, we managed to get funding just for project design. And that gave us the space to be a bit more honest and transparent. Somebody mentioned boundaries too, and this ties with that as well, which was it gave us the opportunity to set those boundaries in a more democratic manner. Some other questions came up about authentic language and predetermined solutions. And I think that's sort of like the storm clouds always over our head have to do with this sense of the planners, the planning mentality who wants to have predetermined solutions. That still dominates much of the funding, both in national governments and international development aid, where the fascination with logical frameworks and predetermined indicators is very difficult to beat. A friend of mine wrote an article, Wendy Corey wrote an article called Decision Makers Want Communication, What They Don't Want is Participation, because it messes up their plans. And so in our communication book, we did talk a lot about the two mindsets. And I think that comes from William Easterly's book, saying that there's planners and there's listeners, and planners have a design in mind, listeners don't. And in this day and age, it's very difficult to be in either of those poles, but those are two interesting ways of thinking. So,
Ricardo,
yes.
there are a couple of more interesting observations.
Oh, please tell me.
Yeah, and one is participation do not have the capacity to facilitate participation. They know the language, but do not have the capabilities. And customs and tradition led to the exclusion of certain members, and challenging to understand to what extent communities want to get involved and participate, and to what extent they feel they must for political reasons or because they hope to gain something from collaborating. I'm constantly questioning how power structure impact participatory methods.
Yeah. I think a lot of this I'll cover in the next section, but these are very good challenges. Yeah. Let me know when the chat slows down.
You can go ahead.
Yeah. So one issue that I mentioned earlier is for those of you in grad school, the ethical review boards, at least when I was doing grad school, required predetermined definition of methods, and very much in participatory development, you don't want to do that. And so one of the challenges is to understand our ethics review board. I think they're becoming more flexible and maximizing the places where you can say this will be updated as the process evolves. But one of the challenges with participation and grad work is that you have an agenda. And so you're setting the boundaries. And some of the questions that came in the chat about the legitimacy or the interest of other people to become involved can be really limiting because you're driving this. I've seen at least 2 student grad projects where they separated the intervention from the study. So they basically said, I'm going to facilitate a process and then I'm going to change hats and evaluate it or document it. And that gave them a little bit more transparency. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is the second part of the presentation. And I wanted to share with you this notion of readiness. Readiness is a weird term. It's very difficult to translate into other languages. Even in English, it has these multiple meanings. It's a state, a condition, a willingness. I'm going to read through these items and then share with you some stories. In readiness, one of the things you need to do is an assessment of organizational culture, whether that organization happens in a place where there's histories of abuse, the level of power differentials with funders, whether they're private funders or government, the staff profiles and the attitudes of the people in the organization, the resources, the constraints in money and time, and the true commitment to reflect and learn. Readiness, the notion of readiness comes from utilization-focused evaluation, which is an evaluation approach developed by Michael Quinn Patton. And very often he refers to readiness as something you do before you start an evaluation to find out whether the conditions allow. I've had a very difficult time, for those of you who are Spanish speakers, to translate into Spanish. I'm sure in Tagalog and in French and in other languages, it would have, again, a whole bunch of different words that would have to be used to complement the meaning. But clarifying expectations is an important element of readiness, and it needs attention early on, as we have already discussed and some of your contributions underline. So much of it is hidden, and you cannot assume others are understanding things in the same manner. When I say so much of it is hidden, it's often if you're applying for a grant or you're responding to requests for proposals for a contract, a lot of the readiness is not there. It's stuff you have to discuss before you sign the contract. And so from a communication point of view, one of the things I've been working with our team is the idea that the readiness part of communication, listening before telling equation, is asking questions and waiting for answers and not assuming what each person will say. In other words, be prepared to be surprised. And again, the whole readiness issue is a tricky one, especially if you're constrained by your own organization and you have pressures to deliver. But if you don't look at readiness and are able to adjust your strategy using those stages and ladders of participation, if you don't do that, then it's going to come and bite you after, because it'll emerge because the contradictions cannot stay quiet. I've just added a little drawing from years ago when I was working as an agricultural extension worker. And one of the things I was doing, because at the time I was very good at drawing, is I was making a an agricultural extension booklet. And at one point, I took a picture of Susana as she was milking the dairy goats. And I put that on the screen and I traced it because I wasn't very good at drawing human shapes. And I went back to the farmers and I showed them this and I said, is this image clear? And the reaction was, that's not Susana because she wasn't milking that day. And first of all, they figured out it was the person that I had photographed, which I didn't expect. And second, they gave it a moment, which was not what I was expecting. And to me, that was the beginning of my work in adult education and graphic art, which is using images to figure out how people perceive things. And again, this was an example for me of how unready I was in producing this extension manual, because I had assumed that what I was conveying was understood and they were perceiving it totally different. So for those of you interested in yet another tool set, this is one that I've been using for a while. The name of the publication is at the bottom of the screen and the website is sas2.net. Some of you, I'm sure, may have heard of it. It used to be called Social Analysis Systems 2 because it was a second version. It's the work of Jacques Chevalier and Daniel Buckles in Ottawa. And this was supported by IDRC for many years. And the beauty of this work, and you can access this manual free online through the link at the bottom, is that they took a whole bunch of tools, and many of us in the participatory field are very interested in tools, and they organized them in a way I had not seen before. And so they grouped them into these 6 categories. And one of the things that I find really useful, if you look in number 1, is the third bullet says skillful means or skills in means. And that's the reference to the practical wisdom that comes from doing this many times and figuring out when, which tool, and what sequence to use them. And so I don't want to be very tool oriented, but I know many of you would be interested. This is one website that is very rich because it also has many case studies of how this has been used. But I'm signaling here a couple of the tools that became very useful for me because increasingly in my work, participation had meant engaging multiple stakeholders together. And doing that becomes even more complex, and some of the inputs in your chat emphasized some of the contradictions that may happen in doing that. And so in engaging multiple stakeholders, some of these issues that I've been mentioning become even more messy. So again, these slides will be shared, so you'll be able to see that website, but sas2.net is recommended. So stakeholder analysis is one thing that is hugely important in participatory processes with multiple partners. And increasingly in our work, you're not just dealing with a community, you're dealing with a community and a health worker and a health authority and an international donor, etc. And so Mitchell et al. Came up with a really interesting analysis that I came across, which is said that any person or organization that has 3 things will be recognized as a stakeholder. If they have power, legitimacy, and urgency, they will be identified. And so the theory suggests that those with 2 of those attributes stand a good chance of being noticed and invited to the negotiating table, whereas those with only 1 may be dismissed. So the idea of who is able to come to the table is often has to do with whether they already have power, legitimacy, and urgency. Often the most disenfranchised have neither of those. Therefore, to bring them in, you have to break the rule, or the opposite. And then the next point is, what is important is to make explicit who was identified, under what criteria, who was invited but did not attend, and why. And so here comes the notion of why the most powerful don't come to the table. And the negotiation literature talks about the BATNA, or the best alternative to negotiated action. And in a BATNA, it means that a very powerful stakeholder doesn't come to your multi-stakeholder meeting because they don't have to, because negotiated action gets in the way of their designs and priorities. I had a situation in a workshop we did in the fisheries sector in Chile and South America, where the industrial fleets, the big fishing fleets who some felt were the culprits of the overfishing problems did not come to the table, even though they had been invited repeatedly. But why? Because they had a BATNA. They did not have to come. And so the identifying stakeholders has to do with the idea of figuring out who are the least powerful, the most powerful, and under what conditions can you bring them together. So this power, legitimacy, and urgency has always been a really good guideline for me, because it sort of tells you beware who you're missing, or beware who you think is going to come and doesn't show up. One tool that comes out of the SAS2.net work is this very simple stakeholder map, or rainbow map, where you can locate stakeholders on the basis of the degree to which they are affected by an issue or a project, and the degree to which they have influence. And again, you do this as a way to make sure you're not missing out people, or that the people you want to involve are able to come. This example comes from work that Jacques Chevalier did in Quebec on a tourism planning effort. I was able to work with that team again in Northern Ontario about 10 years ago, in doing a participatory planning exercise for local Aboriginal planners. And here's an example of us using the same tool. So here comes some aspects that I think one of your chats mentioned, which is the difference between facilitating and convening. Who convenes and how they facilitate are two dimensions that should not be taken for granted. A convener with legitimacy in the eyes of different stakeholders can bring together the parties that other external agencies cannot, simply because of the trust they have earned. The convener need not also be the facilitator. An external facilitator can also be more effective because they can ask naive questions that a local convener would be embarrassed to ask. And facilitation is a skill that can create an atmosphere of trust where weaker stakeholders may begin to gain a voice and come to the table with more confidence. And this has to do with the issue of voice and agency. The reason this is so important is that convening is enormously complex. In the Chilean workshop that I mentioned to you, the convener was a combination of a local university and a United Nations agency. And we took 6 months to organize the workshop. And notwithstanding their convening power, they still had difficulties. We were the facilitators, not the conveners. And so if you're able to separate those two, under some circumstances, it allows the facilitator to focus on the procedures and the convener to focus on the power. And that's something that is not always possible. But what I found interesting is that I'm going to go back here a couple of slides. The issue of power, legitimacy, and urgency seem to be relevant also for convening. And so this part comes from negotiation literature. And I have found it very interesting because multi-stakeholder processes can be so politically sensitive. So I'm of an age where I started to use media in participation with the old analog technologies, whether it was radio or even film before video came up. Some of these pictures are from some work I did years ago with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation that had a workshop in the early 80s called Methods It was all these media for participants. So the whole idea of active listening, broadcasting, or recording procedures and events would be of interest to policymakers, bringing information. And this is something like it would just change my and I got more involved and I co-work and found that the depends from intellectual planner in the working told in reality. Hello, hello. Am I still on?
Yeah, you're still on, Ricardo. We've lost your screen.
Yeah, I had an interruption here. Hold on a second. Is that better?
Yeah, you might just want to kind of give us a quick synopsis of the last minute or two, because it was broken up, the audio.
Where did I break up here?
Yeah, just as you came into that slide there.
Yeah, so sorry about that. What I was trying to summarize is, in my experience, I started working with analog communication technology back at the time when I was with FAO. The idea of using radio and video to bring information from people on the way up, as opposed to the dissemination side of things. And then as I worked in agricultural development, I came across this notion that with the same terminology, a farmer and a planner were seeing the world differently. And that sort of shaped my interest in using media to unpack the different ways in which we see reality. Now, this is an interesting image. I don't know if it's what they call a rich picture, or a picture of a complex system. And this was drawn by a number of students at Wageningen who came from different sub-Saharan African countries for a training. And they were illustrating the complexity of sustainable water use in the Netherlands. And so this is a rich picture where they consulted with all the different stakeholders and basically said, if you want to improve groundwater in the Netherlands, these are the issues and these are the stakeholders you have to engage. And so increasingly the work we do requires multiple stakeholders because our world is so interconnected and complex. And so I'm going to share with you an experience we had. This was 2001 in Northwestern Ontario. In planning the introduction of high-speed internet into remote communities that in some cases didn't have phones yet. The convener was a First Nations organization that was committed to bringing in high-speed internet to the communities. And we were able to be in each community for a whole week. And one day a week, we would convene all the stakeholders in one sector. So we invented this diagram on the fly. We called it spray diagram because people were spraying their ideas. And we said, if you're going to bring in high-speed internet into this community, what are your own goals? What would better education look like in Deer Lake? And so the different community members put in their ideas around the table, and we then classify them in terms of what looked like results, which ones emphasize native language and culture, which refer to facilities or programs. And from then we moved on to organizing it in a way where we could come up with a vision of the results that the education workers were looking forward. We were able to then organize it in groups and say the programs would be in green, and what to measure would be the yellow stickies. And this process was new to us. We improvised it on the spot. The whole idea was to capture what people wanted. And ironically, Industry Canada, which was one of the funders of this work, then said this had to be done every time, all over the country, if this was going to be, if high-speed internet was going to be brought to remote communities. The funder got very excited. What we did with this was basically take the indicators and the programs they wanted and do planning with them. In this case, what was interesting is none of us knew what this technology would do. We were all visioning a desirable future. And so there were current programs that could be enhanced, and there were new programs that could come out of that. And one of the things that I came to learn as a result of this work is that the real outcome of this was a sense of ownership over the process, even though they had a team, the technical team that was going to follow this up. But the very fact of being consulted about visions gave him a sense of ownership. And I'll tell you a fun story that came out. I'm going to go back one slide. The day we, in one of the little stickies that you probably cannot read in the size of the picture here, when they said, how are they going to track this? They said to us, one of the cards said a whistle. And we said, what do you mean by a whistle? They said, look, these are remote communities in the far north. You can only go in and out through winter roads in the cold season or flying in. And they said, if we have better education, we'll have more youth staying in the community, which means we'll have enough kids to have 2 hockey teams. Next time you come, you'll hear a whistle because there'll be a hockey game on. That's our indicator. And so I thought it was a wonderful indicator, and it was there. So it went into their planning tables that we showed to the First Nations Authority and to the federal government. So coming to a close to my presentation, I wanted to go back to this model that came from Van Dyke, a recursive model of access to media. And this was when, this was 2001. So this was at the time when the internet was expanding and people had telecenters and to access technology. And he came up with this idea of if a technology is going to be of interest, you need to have mental access. You need to have motivation to access it. You need to want it. Then you need to have material access for the hardware. That's where telecenters at the time became important. And then you need to have strategic or skill access. You need to know what to do with that. And after that, some different usages or applications will emerge. And once they do that, a new innovation will come and you'll start again. And this was meant for technology, but I think it also refers to participation in the sense that a participatory approach is almost like a technology. And if you know the tools, as somebody who would know how to use a computer, you need to use it in a respectful way. And that's why I use the notion of effective use in this presentation, which came from Michael Gerstein. And I'm going to read to you a little bit of what he mentioned about effective use. He says, the key element in all of this is not access. In this case, he referred to infrastructure and terminals. And rather, what is significant is having access, and then with that access, having the knowledge, the skill, the supportive organizational and social structures to make effective use of that access and technology to enable social and community objectives. So I believe that participation is also a technology. All of these tools, and using them wisely has less to do with the tools and more with your knowledge, your skill, the supportive organizational and social structures to make it effective and relevant. So that's the end of my presentation. We are at the top of the hour, and I'm going to pass this on to Harul because the breakout room instructions are coming up, and the focus of the breakout rooms is for you to digest what you just heard, combine it with your own experiences and wisdom, and come up with what are the principles that are non-negotiable. Harul, I'll pass this on to you. Harul, do you want me to start commenting on the cards from the breakout rooms? I cannot hear Harul, but I think I'm going to go ahead and just comment on what I'm seeing in the breakout room. Got it open in a different screen so I can read it.
Yeah, Ricardo, yes, you can go ahead and you can see the breakout room board,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for contribution. So Ricardo will try to summarize all the what you have done so far and what ideas you came up with your very interesting discussion. I was able to visit all the breakout rooms and I saw a lot of excitement in some of those rooms.
So I'm going to focus on a few selected ones, and I'll ask Harold and Gord to signal anything that I miss, but I'm going to do it by breakout room, selecting the ones that look more, beyond just initial statements. In breakout room 1, there's the non-negotiables, careful planning, appropriate stakeholder engagement, transparency, and accountability, a culture of listening. I really like that one, and I think those are those are all sort of echoing some of the issues in the presentation. There's another one that says relationships of trust and respect within partners. Easier said than done. I think building trust takes time. And in some of the breakout rooms that I listened in, there was discussions about what happens after and who receives the knowledge, who shares the knowledge, who's empowered to do that. And so, I mean, for me, one of the lessons has been, if you want to do participatory work, it's much easier if you stay in place and you build relationships over time as opposed to in and out. And so trust is really a currency that is, it's not that it's negotiable, it's really hard to earn. And then you have to nurture it. I'm going to move to the second breakout room. Acknowledge and introducing personal agendas. Yes, that transparency is so important. One of the issues that came up in some of the discussions is, if you're doing research on health in a community, who owns the problem and who has the resources to address it? Is it you as a researcher, or is it the community? And so very often we're in this paradox where we have the resources to do participatory research or participatory action research, but we're the ones owning the budget. And so then you have to go back to transparency and acknowledging what is doable within those constraints. In the ideal situation, you're at the service of a community that owns the resources, invites you as a facilitator or as a researcher. There's another one that says being honest about conflicts of interest. Yes, and there's also another one that I would derive from that, which is addressing conflicts. Very often participation is used in an environment where you assume some sort of collaboration and cohesiveness, but very often you're entering into an environment where there's conflicts within the community and participation is uneven as a result of power disbalances. And this connects to another card on the right on that same breakout room that says acknowledge power positions and making space for them to change. And that can take time. So again, the issue of timelines, which is also another card, is so tricky here, especially if you're bound by a research project or a thesis project. I'm moving on to the third one, just to try to cover the ground. It also talks about conflicts, efforts to minimize it or walk away. There's cases where the conflict is so severe that they don't need participatory approaches, they need mediation. Considering the culture you're working in, with what participation can look like depending on the community you're working, absolutely. You need to work with insiders if you're not from there. User-centered design, how can this project be applied and access to the end of the user? I think that the idea of continuity beyond is very important. I think in my case, some of the most frustrating experiences participation was when it was in and out, because that's what my employer required, and I kept on apologizing. So acknowledging the constraints of your own employer, the spaces of work you have. My best experiences have been long-term relationships, staying in place or available over long periods of time. There's another card on breakout room 3. It says the role of organization, their power and influence. Is there a bias that should be disclosed to the community? If possible. All organizations have power issues and interests of influence. This is to do with readiness before you go beyond the hosting organization to the community. Again, it could be that you find that the hosting organization does not have a healthy relationship with the community, and that may be a time to stop the process. I'm going to move, looking at the time here, to number 4. Trust came out big in a couple of places. Readiness to participate by community members. Yes, that came up in several of the groups that I listened into, is don't expect community members to have the time or interest. And there was another card somewhere I saw about whether they get paid or not. I think we've all been exposed to situations where people come because there's food or some kind of stipend for transportation. Those are very delicate decisions, because in the end, getting the real sense of why people are able and willing, especially disenfranchised rural women, are they able to have the time to come? So it's, again, readiness has to do with to what extent are people really able to do that. One tool that is really, really interesting is if you Google in the Theory of Change org, the Superwoman case study. It's like a theory of change, a diagram of all the preconditions for women to participate in an event. And it's really like an analysis of readiness. If you're offering an event for people to be consulted with, have you addressed all the barriers that different people have to actually come, assuming they want to? And so all the preparatory steps become so much more important than the participatory event in many cases. Moving forward to number 5, infrastructure to allow free participation and access. I think that's the same topic we're talking about. Measurements and ideas to facilitate integration. I'm not sure I can understand that one without more context. Respect of cultures and conversation conventions, yes. Have the ability to participate throughout the full research cycle. I think that was mentioned, and there was a beautiful example from one of you of a project where participants were actually involved in all stages of the research, including presenting at a conference. And then maintain separation of convener and facilitator. Yes, in many cases that's healthy. You may not be able to do it in all situations, but I have found that to be a great one, because the convener can facilitate a lot of those cultural and power issues that you may be blind to coming in from the outside. Moving on to number 6, local buy-in. Yes, hard to obtain, but once you have it, it's a totally different game story. There's a card in the middle that says, try to set aside politics. I don't think that's possible. I think we are all living in a very political world. You may draw those boundaries, but they may be artificial. That may be a very tricky one. Mutual recognition of participants, yes. Transparent ground rules for participation, absolutely. Setting terms of rules to participation is a very good one. It's very useful, and I'm sure many of you have done this in events to get participants to come up with the rules, so there's active listening and respect in the process as well. There's one that is so small it's like going to the eye doctor, so I'm moving to number 7. Ensuring diversity of participation, yes. In that example I said with Chile, we almost failed entirely because the most powerful did not show up. Ownership of the process from the participants, and I think that's so key. I mentioned before the issue of ownership, and this gives me a hook into that. The whole idea from soft systems methodology from Checklin and Scholes is that whoever owns the problem should own the process to undo it. And that's where so often, if we come with an organization that has the funds to come and do development onto people, we forget that if they own the process, maybe our best role is to give them the resources and the wherewithal to do that. When I worked with First Nations in Northern Ontario, they required that consultants train the local people on the methods, which was the idea that they would then run the process on their own. Restitution, provide useful information post-participation. Yes, we heard different levels of that and the importance of engaging them in all stages of research where possible. Looking at the time here, I'm moving on to number 8. Non-negotiables include careful planning, appropriate stakeholder engagement, transparency, and accountability, a culture of listening. Thank you. That's a wonderful summary for much of what I was sharing with all of you. And I think number 9 was empty. I think that's it. So I'm trying to cover some of the ground, but Harold, maybe we should open this to some questions. Let me know what you recommend at this point.
Thank you, Ricardo, for summarizing. Yeah, I think we can take a few questions at the end. We have some more minutes, 10 minutes more to go 11 o'clock. So if any kind of last minute questions or discussion that Ricardo can respond, please go ahead. You can use your chat box or you can unmute and say it. Helen?
Yeah, hi everyone. Helen Hambley here in Guelph. And Ricardo, thanks very much. One of the comments that came up in the group that I just wanted to share to you, Ricardo, and to Ada as well, is that the participants were talking about like a shared folder, a shared drive with some of the references or some of the tools and etc. that could be shared. Very helpful. And maybe also we can also contribute some more case studies or examples from each of our projects, and including you know, any type of yeah, shared work. That would be super. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, we'll take into consideration and we'll share the resources with the participants. Yeah. Any other question from anyone? You can raise your hand or use your chat box. Okay, I think I can see that there are a lot of discussion actually went on the breakout room discussion, and you have probably had a chance to socialize and reflect on the broader questions for this session. Ricardo, do you have any last point to share?
No, it's been a pleasure sharing ideas with many of you who have as much or more experience, and to have people from so many universities I visited in the past, dear colleagues who are there, and wonderful to see the interest, and looking forward to more lessons. And at the Harold, if you can share, I guess the project will have a place for the PowerPoint to be shared, because it's the literature that I mentioned is included there. But thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat with you all over the place. It's been a pleasure.
There is another question. Do you have recommendation for the reading around ethical consideration? We'll actually share all the readings, list of readings that Ricardo mentioned in his presentation. Thank you, Ricardo, for your excellent presentation and sharing your thoughts. And thank you everyone for participation in this webinar, first part of our webinar session. We did not expect such amount of participation, but it was really motivating. And some of the, in the morning, I noticed that there are a lot of interest in looking at participation in virtual sphere, like in digital sphere. So our idea is to move from this part of the session, as I mentioned in the morning, and then in the next part, we'll actually focus on some methods and tools, especially for using participation in online sphere. There are various methods and tools. We'll find how to present it, and what are their actually characteristics, and what are the facilities that they have in terms of participating through online means. And then going forward, we will try to, in our third part of this series, answer the question how we can actually respond to these new means of participation using different digital tools. So understanding participation in the digital means. Now today we got some idea of what are non-negotiable, and then we'll have some methods and tools, and then we'll try to understand that how participation can be defined or redefined in a online and digital sphere. So this is the idea of the whole series. We have your contact, and many of you actually granted to us to touch base. So we'll touch base with our upcoming 2 series. And as I said, like for the second part or the third part, if you have any idea to get involved or just get in touch with me, or the 3 project activities that I mentioned, especially for our next workshop, and also publication. If you have any idea to contribute and any examples or case studies that we can actually document as part of this initiative, it could be, part of that edited book or journal, especially issues of journal we are thinking. I actually contacted few journals, and I hope that we'll definitely get say a decision from them. And I'm also in the process of contacting Routledge for an edited book. I'm very hopeful that it's going to happen soon. So this is, I see there are a couple of chat box. No, there is no question. If not, then thank you for staying with us. It's 2 hours webinar. I hope that it was not that boring. You enjoyed some of the interactive session, had some chance to socialize. As you said, like if it would be face to face, definitely it would have been more fun and more enjoying. And still, I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you for your contribution. And with that, I want to conclude the session. If you have any last question, we have still 4 minutes.
I guess there is a question from Gordon Go. When do you hope to put out a call for papers for the publication?
Okay, Gordon, that's an interesting question that we need to decide in ourselves. The first thing we have to think about the workshop, and how we're going to organize the workshop. And I think part of the process would be to put out a call for contribution to that workshop. And then going forward that, and that workshop, we don't know whether it will be face-to-face or whether virtual means. We have to monitor the current situation of COVID-19. But in one or another way, even if it is in a virtual session like this one, we will definitely organize some kind of workshop presentation with those who are interested. And then from there, we'll go for publication. Thank you very much. I appreciate your participation. Good morning, good evening,